When you start PCCU, you should see the splash screen. So from here you can see it says Totalflow Measurement and Control Systems. So we refer to this as the splash screen. So when you're ready to connect to your G4, go ahead and plug it in, and then if you have an entry button, you can click on that and it goes directly to the entry mode, or you could do the initial connect button, which is on the left of the entry button here. If I go ahead and click the initial connect button, then I get a window that shows my station ID, location, and the type of device that I'm connected to. And then I have a few other buttons here. One is collect historical data, calibration, monitor mode, entry setup, and registry. And so I mentioned already the entry button up here in the top left would be the same as this entry setup button. And just the same, calibrate, if I were to go to calibrate, would be the same as clicking this calibrate button with the tools. If I were to go to collect historical data, it would be the same as the collect button here at the top. Monitor to the right of collect would be the same as the monitor button, and so on. So now that we've made it to this point, we're going to go ahead and click the entry setup button. And this should take us directly into the entry mode. So now that we're in the entry mode, we have our device ID up here at the top left, and that's important. This unit, this G4 that I'm plugged into at the moment, has a device ID of Totalflow. So from the factory, when you receive your G4, it should be Totalflow until you change it, and we'll cover that later in this CD. If I come on down here, I have communications, my I/O interface, my flow measurement, display, holding registers, operations. Now these are applications. I can turn on and turn off different applications, and so to turn on or turn off an application, if you come up here to your device ID and click on it, and you come over to your applications tab, you can see application 0 is system. My communication applications 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Right now on my G4, application 6 is spared out. If I wanted to put something into application 6, I can do that by simply clicking the spare button, and I get a few choices here. So depending on the flash that I have loaded in this G4 will allow me to see which choices I have underneath my application tab. Okay. The next question is, where does Totalflow recommend that you put certain things? So if you come over to your help button on the right hand side and click that, this is going to give me a list of the X Series G4 recommended locations for certain applications. So system is always on application 0, and you can see communications come next, I/O interface, display, holding registers, operations, your flow measurement tubes. And so if I go ahead and scroll down here, you can see we can do 20 measurement tubes on the G4. Then we have some communication spare 31 through 40, XMV 41, 42, 43, 44, 45, Therms master, then we go into level master, then we have some reserve slots. Then we can move on down to Coriolis oil custody transfer, and then it jumps back up to the top here, and you can see a couple more reserves, some IEC applications, alarms, trending, analysis. We'll come on down to valve control, safety system, and plunger applications, pulse accumulator, on down to 159. So we have a total of 160 applications to be able to turn on in the G4. Okay, if we come on over, we have an app licensing tab. We'll cover this more in the credit key section. This is where we would load and unload credit keys to be able to turn on and turn off applications. Resources, this is going to let me know how my current processor is running on my G4, what the average processor usage is, the available memory, RAM file space, flash file space, and if I have an SD card installed, what my file space on my SD card would be. And then if we jump over to the registry tab, here I can see my digital board part number, flash part number, the OS, the operating system part number that I'm running, including the part numbers of all the different devices or applications that we could turn on. Okay. Go up to Operate and then drop down to your Setup and System Setup. From here, when we connect to the device locally, we get a Setup tab. It asks what port are we connected to, and so in this case I'm connected to my G4 with a USB cable, and when I plugged it in it came up as COM7, and I could also choose network from the list or ActiveSync. So if I choose network, I can put in an IP address here, or like you can see here I have different network IDs. So I'm going to jump back up here and choose COM7. That's the one I'm using to talk to it right now. And then if you wanted to connect to your unit automatically, so this is an auto connection selection. So here, whenever I start up PCCU, if none is checked, the unit just sits on the splash screen until I tell it to go somewhere. If I choose entry here, the next time I connect up with PCCU, it skips the splash screen and should go directly into the entry mode when I connect up. The collect button, when I connect up with PCCU, would go directly to the historical collection, and then the last one here, if it's chosen, then it would go directly to the initial connect screen, which is what we did at the beginning of this tutorial. Now, over here at the toolbar buttons, up here at the top, this is considered the toolbar, and these are the buttons that we're turning on. So if you look, we have connect, disconnect, NGC operate, entry, mode, monitor, terminal, collect, calibrate, and so forth. So for example, if I wanted to turn off my collect button here, you can see I have collect up in my toolbar. If I uncheck collect and go ahead and close this, it takes the collect button away. So we can modify our toolbar based off of the choices that we choose right here in the toolbar section. So if I go ahead and turn on the collect again and close, my collect button is back, and now I'm ready to do historical collection directly from the toolbar. So I'm going to go back to Setup, jump over to the Directory Path tab. It's important to have the correct directory paths here. When you install PCCU 7, it should install directly on your hard drive. So in most cases it would be C:\PCCU 7 \, and then each directory has its unique place. So for example, your ID database path is going to be device ID, and let me jump on down here to trends, for example, are going to get pushed directly into a folder called trends. Your data file path is going to get directly pushed into a folder called PCCU data, and so forth. So if you wanted to push this to a different location, or if this were blank for whatever reason, you can come over to the right here and do a browse, and we could browse out and find a different place to push any one of these topics. Miscellaneous tab. Inside here we have a bunch of selections. We have an auto load local WinCPC 32 if we're going to do remote communication, all the way down to force calibration checks. If I were to choose this, when I go in to calibrate my G4, it's going to force me to do a calibration check before I can move on in and calibrate the unit. Now, if your company doesn't require you to do a calibration check before you calibrate, you could come into this miscellaneous tab and go ahead and uncheck your force calibration checks, and then go directly into calibration and skip the prompt that comes up and tells you to do your checks first. So this gives you a little bit of control over your PCCU software. And then we also have a file capacity, and in most cases your FCU daily records and events and logs. This has to do with historical collection. In most cases we would leave this default, and so it would be up to you in your company if you want to change these. Also, I want to mention the help file. So you may have a question about what some of these choices are. So if you go to the help button on any screen that we are connected to, it's context sensitive, so it should go directly to the list of topics that you're looking at. So for example, miscellaneous setup option is this list that we're looking at here. So auto load local WinCPC 32. This gives me a short description of what that is and what it'll do for me. limited number of open child windows on down to forced calibration checks and so on. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and close out of this. And then we want to jump up here to the View tab, and notice that I'm on Advanced. We have a Basic, Advanced, and Expert. So if I chose the Expert tab, it says warning, changing parameters from this mode should only be done performed by factory personnel or customers who have been factory trained. Making changes without proper guidance or training can lead to abnormal operation. Do you still want to operate in factory mode? And so in this case, I'm going to say yes. And it should take me back to the tree view. So I'm going to go back up to Totalflow and go to my Applications tab. If you notice, this looks a little different. We don't only just have the application and type and directory, we now have a station, and we can restart certain applications and things like that. So here I have one measurement tube turned on in application 11. It's an AGA3 measurement tube. And if I put in a certain station ID, this might be, for example, XYZ location. And if I go ahead and send that, anytime you make a change on the Totalflow software, be sure you send your changes. And I'm going to go ahead and close out to the splash screen and connect back up to this unit. So now that I've connected to my Totalflow, you can see we have a new heading called XYZ, and underneath that is my flow measurement tube, and then all the flow measurement tube setup data. So inside the G4 you have the ability to organize your tubes a little more than you did in the G3. So here I've called it XYZ and given it a specific header, and I could go on down the list with unique headers for each measurement tube. Okay, so I jump back over to the Station Setup tab, and if you notice in the left, on each screen that you go to, there will be a gray box with a 3-digit number. And so, for example, in this one it's 0.0.4. That's going to represent my station ID. Location is represented by 0.0.5. And so we have a term, it's application array register number. And so this is your application.array.register. And so the application tab here is the first number. So if you look at application 0 is system. And so if I come back to setup, notice that these guys are starting with 0. So I know that all of these are under the setup application. The app array registers allow us to build Modbus register maps. We can attach those to the app array registers. Also, when we get into operations, we can attach or build an operation based off of an app array register. And next thing we want to look at is extendable help. And so I'm going to go ahead and click on my flow measurement tube, and if you notice over here in the right next to help, we have an X help now. So if I click on this, it gives me an introduction to AGA3 expanded help, and AGA3 is the type of tube that I had turned on. And so if I click the next button, you can see we have an introduction, we have a background write-up on AGA3, and then we have some different wiring layouts and so forth for how you're going to do your flow measurement. So here is the mechanical installation, electrical, and then PCCU setup. So the first thing it goes into is mechanical, and it gives you a small write-up of how to mount the unit, the high and low side on the transducer, hooking up the solar panel, RTD probe wiring, all the way down to power supply and things of that nature. So we're going to scroll all the way down to the bottom here, and I'm just going to hit the next button and take you to the next page. Here we have the mechanical installation, so this is going to be more of, this is an XMV, so this is a external multivariable. Same way with the RTD. And then we're going to go on to the next one, the electrical. This is going to bring in communication wiring and free-wave radio. There's daisy-chained XMVs to a G4, and then here's the pinout for a G4 XFC. XFC has the XIMV interface. An XRC G4 would have AIs across the bottom here. And then, of course, the overview of PCCU32, or in this case PCCU7, the new software. We're going to go on into configuration, and then it's going to walk you through pretty much what we're doing here, setting up your AGA3, your constants, tabs, and factors, and so forth. So you can follow through the help files at any time. They're there for you. Let me go on through here. XMV setup and how to program your XMV if you're using an XMV. And then that's the last one on this page. So, so I'm going to go ahead and close out of expanded help. The tree view over here at the left, it always starts with communications at the top. So if I click on communications, I can tell exactly what communication ports are turned on at the moment. So right now my TCP port is on 9999, the default. My Totalflow remote COM1 is on COM1, and spare is set up to for COM2. And if I was going to use the network, I can put in a network ID, enable DHCP, and so forth. And we'll get into more of this later in this tutorial. If I jump down to XYZ in this case, normally from the factory, Totalflow would be the name of my first measurement tube. Unless I change my station ID, then when I update or hit reread, it would go and update the name of my first measurement tube. Now when we turn on a second measurement tube, then you're going to get the AJ3-1, -2, -3, depending on how many tubes you turn on in your G4. Okay, so we're going to come on down to I/O interface, and here I have DP, static pressure, temperature, RTD. These three are coming in from the XIMV, and then the RTD is separate there. But we have two AIs on board, and so two analog inputs. We have a couple of digital inputs on the G4. These can also be set up as pulse inputs. And then we have a couple of digital outputs on board. And then we could add, like I have here, some TFIO modules. And so these are extension modules that give us more DIs and DOs and analog outputs and analog inputs. And we even have a valve control module. And we'll cover these more in detail later in this tutorial. And I'm going to come on down to flow measurement. And so under flow measurement, you would have multiple tubes that you actually turn on as you add a tube to your G4. Display, this is going to show, this is the actual display that's scrolling on the G4 door on the outside, physically on the outside. We have station ID, date and time, charger, voltage, and battery voltage. And I only have one tube turned on right now, so it's AGA3-1, tube 1 ID, the orifice ID, static pressure, differential, temperature, and flow rate. Last calculation, yesterday's volume, accumulated volume. These are all from tube 1. So if I added a second tube, I probably want to go modify my display. And once again, you can view the tutorial on the display. And I'm going to go and close those up. Holding registers, we'll cover in more detail. Same way with operations. We can go in and do some functions inside your G4 to set it up to control based off of whatever inputs and outputs you run into this program. So I'm going to go up to Operate and come down to File Utilities. Underneath File Utilities, we have Trend File Editor, the Analysis File Editor if you're doing chromatography, bringing it into your G4, even down to Modbus, Slave Register Editor, Host Register Editor, Therms Master if you're going to bring analytical data in. So we can build Modbus request blocks from here. Same way with security. If we're going to use security codes or a password, then we can come in to Operate Security and force a login on the flow computer to make the customer have to sign in. And then if I go to Setup, I have System Setup, Meter ID Manager, which is the same as this turquoise ID up here at the top, and then of course Device Template Editor, which would be the same as this template button. So this concludes the software overview of PCCU7.